When a respected attorney is mysteriously detained at the courthouse, what begins as a simple misunderstanding spirals into something far more troubling. As the minutes tick by and a young man's future hangs in the balance, hidden forces work. Behind the scenes, some to bury the truth, others to expose it. In a place where justice is supposed to be blind, someone is always watching. And in this courthouse, the cameras never blink. Nick Bowden straightened his tie as he exited the subway station 3 blocks from the county courthouse. The September morning carried a hint of fall, crisp enough for the charcoal suit he'd chosen, but sunny enough that he didn't need an overcoat. Perfect weather for what promised to be a perfect day in court. He checked his watch, 8:15 a.m., 45 minutes before the Wilson hearing. Early, as always. Nick lived by his father's mantra, "If you're not early, you're late." His mind drifted to the memory of his dad pressing the smooth leather briefcase into his hands the day he passed the bar exam. "My son, the attorney," his father had said, eyes shining with pride. That same briefcase now swung at Nick's side, worn in just the right places, but still professional. Inside were the carefully prepared motions that would hopefully free his client from charges that should never have been filed. The courthouse came into view as Nick rounded the corner, an imposing limestone structure with wide steps and tall columns. Some of his colleagues complained about its outdated facilities, but Nick appreciated its gravity. These old walls had seen justice served and denied for generations. Today, he hoped, would be a day for justice. Nick climbed the steps with steady confidence, nodding to a court reporter he recognized from previous cases. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Nick Bowden," he answered, voice clear and professional. "Mr. Bowden, it's Darius." His client sounded nervous, which was understandable given the stakes. "Darius, good morning? Are you on your way?" Nick kept, his tone reassuring. "I'm already here, sir, in the waiting area like you said. My mom came with me." "Perfect. Stay there and try to relax. I'm just arriving now and will come find you after I review a few things." Nick ended the call feeling a swell of determination. Darius Wilson was only 22, facing a drug possession charge that could derail his life. The evidence was circumstantial at best, and Nick had identified several procedural issues with the arrest. As he approached the top of the courthouse steps, Nick mentally reviewed the key points of his argument. The search warrant had been executed at night, despite not being authorized for nighttime execution. Furthermore, the officer's body camera had conveniently malfunctioned during the search, and the written report contained inconsistencies about where the drugs were found. Judge Sandoval was a stickler for proper procedure. She would see the problems with this case. Nick nodded to the security guard at the main entrance but headed right, toward the side entrance reserved for court officers and attorneys. He reached into his jacket pocket for his bar card ID as he approached the door. The familiar weight of his Harvard Law School class ring pressed against his finger as he pulled out his identification. 8 years out of law school, and sometimes it still surprised him to see attorney at law after his name. Not because he doubted his abilities. Nick had graduated 3rd in his class and had thrived first as a prosecutor and now as a defense attorney. The surprise came from knowing how unlikely his path had been. Growing up in Oakland's East Side, Nick had seen firsthand how the justice system could crush communities like his. His mother had worked double shifts as a nurse to move them to a better neighborhood with better schools. His father, a postal worker who read law books in his spare time, had filled their small apartment with dreams bigger than their circumstances. "The law is meant to protect everyone equally," his father would say, "but it doesn't work that way unless good people make it work." Nick had carried those words through college and law school, through the microaggressions and the professors who seemed surprised when he excelled. Through the early years as one of very few black prosecutors in the district attorney's office, where he'd eventually grown disillusioned with a system that seemed designed to incarcerate rather than rehabilitate. 3 years ago, he'd made the switch to defense work, opening a small practice that had quickly grown as his reputation for thorough preparation and persuasive arguments spread. Today's case was exactly why he'd made the change. A young man with potential facing charges. That seemed more about filling quotas than serving justice. Nick checked his watch again, 8:22 a.m. He'd have time to find Darius and his mother, review the key points once more, and ensure his client was prepared for the hearing. Then a final review of his notes in the attorney preparation room before heading into Judge Sandoval's courtroom. He adjusted his tie again, a deep blue silk that complemented his suit. Appearance shouldn't matter in a courtroom, but Nick knew it did. Every detail of his presentation was deliberate, from his conservative haircut to his polished shoes. In a system where black men were too often presumed guilty, Nick left nothing to chance. His phone buzzed again. A text from Zoe, his paralegal. Added the Jenkins precedent to your folder. Fifth Circuit case from last year. Perfect match for your argument on improper warrant execution. Good luck today. Nick smiled. Zoe was thorough and brilliant, a second-year law student who worked part-time at his office. He'd have to remember to thank her properly, maybe with tickets to the jazz festival she'd mentioned wanting to attend. The steps beneath his feet felt solid as he reached the top. Through the massive doors, justice awaited. Or at least, the opportunity to fight for it. Nick took a deep breath of the autumn air, held it for a moment, then exhaled slowly, cantering himself, preparing. From his briefcase, he withdrew a small photograph, his parents on their 30th anniversary, both smiling with unmistakable pride. His father had passed away last year, his mother 2 years before that. Neither had lived to see how successful his practice had become, but days like today, Nick felt them watching. "This one's for you, Dad," he whispered, returning the photo to its place. With a final straightening of his shoulders, Nick Bowden approached the attorney's entrance, bar card in hand. His mind was clear, his purpose defined. In Judge Sandoval's courtroom, he would stand for Darius Wilson the way he stood for all his clients, as a shield against injustice and a voice for those the system too often silenced. The morning sun caught the gold lettering on the courthouse facade, equal justice under law. Today, Nick would do his part to make those words true. On the other side of the courthouse, Officer Robert Daniels pulled his patrol car into the reserved spot for law enforcement. He was filling in for Officer Jenkins, who had called in sick. 20 years on the force, and Daniels still hated courthouse duty. Give him street patrol any day over babysitting lawyers and criminals in suits. He adjusted his utility belt as he stepped out of the car. At 52, the extra weight around his middle made the belt sit differently than it had in his younger days. Still, Daniels carried himself with the confidence of a man who commanded respect wherever he went. His salt and pepper hair was cut military short, his uniform pressed to perfection. "Morning, Daniels," called Officer Peterson from the security desk. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Jenkins has the flu," Daniels replied, signing the duty roster. "Lucky me gets to play hall monitor." Peterson laughed. "Main entrance, or attorney section?" "Put me at the attorney's entrance," Daniels said. "At least I won't have to deal with the public all day." As he made his way to his post, Daniels observed the morning crowd filtering into the courthouse. He prided himself on his ability to size people up quickly, a skill honed through decades of police work. The nervous young man in a too big suit Definitely a first-time offender. The harried woman with 3 kids in tow. Custody dispute, no doubt. The slick-looking man in an expensive suit checking his Rolex. Probably a defense attorney getting rich off criminals. Daniels had seen it all, and in his mind, most people fell into clear categories. The world was simpler that way. He took his position at the attorney's entrance, nodding curtly to the lawyers he recognized. Most were regulars at the courthouse, prosecutors he'd worked with on cases over the years. A few defense attorneys he tolerated because everyone deserved representation, even if he thought some lawyers had sold their souls defending people who belonged behind bars. Daniels checked his watch. Judge Sandoval's courtroom would be busy today. He'd testified in her court many times over the years. Tough but fair, people said about her. Daniels thought she was too soft on sentencing, but he kept those opinions to himself. A young woman in a skirt suit approached, flashing her bar card. Lauren Miller, assistant district attorney. Daniels had worked with her on a drug bust last month. "Morning, Officer Daniels," she said cheerfully. "Testifying today?" "Just security duty," he replied. "Courthouse is short-staffed." "Well, try not to fall asleep," she joked. Judge Sandoval's first case is a motion to suppress in the Wilson drug case. "Could be interesting," Daniels grunted in response. The Wilson case. He remembered reading the arrest report. Another dealer claiming police misconduct to escape charges. The story was always the same. As Miller disappeared down the hallway, Daniels settled into his routine, checking IDs and keeping mental notes of who entered. Judge Peterson's clerk with her stack of files. The court reporter with her coffee and equipment bag. A defense attorney Daniels recognized from a case last year. Older white guy who specialized in white-collar crime. His radio crackled with routine security updates from around the building. Daniels half-listened while watching the flow of people, categorizing them automatically based on appearance, behavior, and his years of experience. A group of suited men entered together. Corporate lawyers by the look of their expensive briefcases and matching arrogance. Daniels checked their IDs without really looking. They all fit the stereotype he expected. His attention sharpened when he spotted a well-dressed black man approaching the entrance. Something about him made Daniels pause. The suit was too nice, the leather briefcase too expensive. He carried himself with confidence that seemed, to Daniels, out of place. Daniels straightened up, hand instinctively moving to rest near his belt. The man was reaching into his jacket pocket as he approached the door. In that split second, memories flashed through Daniels's mind. Suspects reaching for weapons, years of training about remaining vigilant, the buddy he'd lost in a routine, traffic stop gone wrong. 20 years of seeing the worst in people had left its mark. The black man pulled out what appeared to be an ID card, his Harvard class ring catching the morning light. But Daniels had already made his assessment. Something didn't fit right in his mental categorization. "Sir, I'll need to see some identification," Daniels said, stepping forward to block the entrance. The man, Nick Bowden, though Daniels didn't know his name yet, looked momentarily surprised, then composed himself. "Of course, officer. I was just getting my bar card." He held out the identification that confirmed he was an attorney licensed to practice law. Daniels took the card, studying it with narrowed eyes. The photo matched the man standing before him, but suspicion had already taken root. In his 20 years on the force, Officer Robert Daniels had learned to trust his instincts above all else, and his instincts were telling him something wasn't right. "Is there a problem, officer?" Nick asked, his voice calm and measured. Daniels turned the bar card over in his hands, examining it closely. "How long have you been practicing law, Mr. Bowden?" 8 years, Nick replied. "I have a hearing in Judge Sandoval's courtroom in..." He checked his watch. 35 minutes. May I have my ID back, please? Daniels didn't return the card immediately. 8 years? You look pretty young to have that much experience. Nick kept his expression neutral, though a familiar tension began building at the base of his neck. He'd had these conversations before. I started practicing right after law school. Harvard, class of 2016. Harvard, huh? Daniels raised an eyebrow. That's quite an accomplishment. Thank you, Nick said, extending his hand for his ID. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to prepare for my hearing. Instead of returning the card, Daniels gestured toward the main entrance. Sir, I'm going to need you to use the public entrance today. There's been some security concerns. Nick frowned. What security concerns? I'm an attorney. I use this entrance every time I'm in court. Just a precaution, Daniels said vaguely. All visitors need to go through the main security checkpoint today. I'm not a visitor, Nick pointed out, his patience beginning to thin. I'm an officer of the court. That's why attorneys have a separate entrance. Daniels crossed his arms. Sir, I'm not going to argue with you. Those are the procedures today. Nick looked around, noticing other attorneys continuing to use the entrance behind Daniels. A white woman in a pantsuit had just walked through, showing her ID with barely a glance from another security officer. Officer, Nick glanced at the name tag. Daniels, I've shown you my bar card. I'm due in court very soon. I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to enter as you've been allowing my colleagues. He kept his voice level, professional. Are you refusing to comply with security protocols? Daniels asked, his tone hardening. Nick took a deep breath. I'm not refusing anything. I'm simply asking why I'm being directed to use a different entrance than other attorneys. By now, a small line had formed behind Nick. He could feel eyes on his back, witnessing the exchange. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Zoe, or Darius wondering where he was. Step aside, sir, Daniels ordered, gesturing for the people behind Nick to come forward. Excuse me. Nick remained where he was, his grip tightening slightly on his briefcase. I said step aside. I need to verify your credentials. Daniels's hand moved to rest on his belt near his radio. These other folks need to get to court. The implied message was clear. Nick was the problem, not the officer's unusual request. A familiar hot pressure built in Nick's chest. But years of experience in courtrooms had taught him to control his reactions. Showing anger would only make the situation worse. Officer Daniels, Nick said quietly, I don't understand why my credentials require verification when others don't. I've shown you my bar card. I'm an attorney headed to a hearing in Judge Sandoval's courtroom. Daniels stepped closer. Sir, that ID could be fake, for all I know. We've had issues with people using fake credentials. Now, you can either follow directions and use the public entrance, or we can discuss this further in the security office. The threat hung in the air between them. Nick weighed his options quickly. Making a scene would only delay him further, potentially harming his client's case. Using the public entrance meant waiting in a long line, going through metal detectors, and possibly missing crucial preparation time. May I at least have my ID back? Nick asked. I'll need to hold on to this until I can verify it, Daniels replied. Security protocols. What protocols exactly? Nick pressed. I've been practicing in this courthouse for years and have never heard of attorneys' credentials being confiscated. Are you questioning my authority? Daniels's voice took on an edge. A few feet away, Nick noticed a court clerk he recognized. Maria Gonzalez from Judge Wu's courtroom. She was watching the exchange with concern. Ms. Gonzalez, Nick called. Could you please tell Officer Daniels that I'm an attorney? I believe we've seen each other in court many times. Before the E, clerk could respond. Daniels stepped between them. "Sir, do not attempt to interfere with security procedures. Ms. Gonzalez, please continue on your way." The clerk hesitated, then nodded apologetically to Nick before hurrying inside. "Officer Daniels," Nick said, fighting to keep frustration. From his voice, "I have a client waiting for me. A young man whose future depends on this hearing. Please, let me do my job." "And I'm doing mine," Daniels replied flatly. "Public entrance or security office. Those are your options." People continued moving past them, some casting curious glances at the confrontation. Nick felt the weight of their stares, wondering what they saw: an attorney being hassled or just another black man causing trouble. "Fine," Nick finally said. "I'll use the public entrance, but I want my ID back now. As I said, I need to verify." "That ID is my property and my professional credential," Nick interrupted, his patience finally wearing thin. "You have no right to confiscate it." Daniels's face hardened. "Sir, your tone is becoming aggressive." Nick almost laughed at the absurdity. He'd maintained perfect composure while this officer had stopped him without cause, directed him away from the proper entrance, and was now holding his professional identification. "I want to speak to your supervisor," Nick said firmly. Daniels reached for his radio. "That can be arranged." But instead of calling a supervisor, he spoke into the radio. "Security to attorney's entrance. I have an uncooperative individual refusing to comply with procedures." Nick stared in disbelief. "I haven't refused anything. I asked for my ID back and questioned why I'm being treated differently than other attorneys." "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside right now and place your briefcase on the ground," Daniels ordered, his voice louder now, drawing more attention. "My briefcase contains confidential client documents," Nick protested. "I can't just—" "On the ground, now," Daniels commanded, his hand moving to his holster. And just like that, a routine morning had become something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something all too familiar. Nick slowly lowered his briefcase to the ground, keeping his movements deliberate and his hands visible at all times. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained carefully composed. Years of practicing. Law had taught him how quickly situations could turn, how easily misunderstandings could become tragedies. "My client's case files are in that briefcase," Nick said evenly. "They're protected by attorney-client privilege." Daniels didn't respond. His radio crackled, and a voice announced that backup was on its way. Within moments, another officer appeared. Younger, with a buzz cut and eager eyes. His name tag read Officer Brooks. "What's the situation?" Brooks asked, looking between Daniels and Nick. "Individual attempting to enter through the attorney entrance with suspicious credentials," Daniels reported crisply. "Became confrontational when asked to verify his identity." Nick opened his mouth to object to this mischaracterization, but years of legal experience told him it would only make things worse. Instead, he spoke calmly. "Officer Brooks, I'm Nick Bowden, attorney at law. I have a hearing in Judge Sandoval's courtroom in," he checked his watch. 25 minutes. "My client is waiting." Brooks looked uncertain, glancing at Daniels for guidance. "We need to check his credentials and that briefcase," Daniels said firmly. "Let's move him to the security office." "My briefcase contains confidential client documents," Nick repeated. "You have no legal right to search it." "Sir, for all we mind to you know, you could be carrying contraband," Daniels countered. "Security office. Now." Nick weighed his options quickly. Making a stand here could escalate the situation further. The security office would have cameras and witnesses. Perhaps someone with more sense would recognize him or see the absurdity of the situation. "I'd like to make a phone call to inform my client I'm being delayed," Nick said, as Brooks picked up his briefcase. "You can do that from the security office," Brooks replied, not unkindly. The two officers escorted Nick through a side door, away from the public areas of the courthouse. The hallway was empty, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The security office turned out to be little more than a glorified storage room with a desk and two chairs. A single camera blinked in the corner. Nick noted its location, automatically, a habit formed from years of courtroom work. "Sit down," Daniels ordered, pointing to one of the chairs. Nick complied, keeping his back straight and his hands visible on his knees. "I need to contact my client," he repeated. "And I'd like my bar card returned, please." Daniels ignored him, turning to Brooks. "Search the briefcase." "Sir," Nick said, his voice taking on the firm tone he used in court, "that briefcase contains confidential attorney-client materials. Searching it without a warrant violates my client's rights and professional ethics rules." Brooks hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "We don't need a warrant for security searches," Daniels insisted. "Open it." "Then I need to be present when you open it," Nick said. "And I need to document what documents you're viewing." Daniels scoffed. "You're not dictating procedures here." Brooks set the briefcase on the desk and unfastened the latches. Inside were neatly organized folders, legal pads, and a tablet. "Officer Brooks," Nick said quietly, "I want the record to show that I object to this search of privileged materials." "There's no record here, Counselor," Daniels said mockingly. "This is a security check." Brooks began leafing through the folders while Daniels watched. Nick could see the labels from where he sat. "Wilson defense. Motion to suppress. Witness statements." "I need to make that phone call," Nick said again. "My client is waiting in court." "Your phone," Daniels demanded, holding out his hand. Nick slowly reached into his pocket and retrieved his smartphone. Instead of handing it over, he began to dial. "Give me the phone, sir," Daniels snapped. "I'm calling my paralegal to inform my client." Daniels grabbed the phone from Nick's hand. "This will be returned to you when we're finished here." Nick took a deep breath. The clock on the wall showed 8:47 a.m. His hearing was scheduled for 9 p.m. Judge Sandoval was notoriously punctual and intolerant of tardiness. "May I at least know how long this security check will take?" Nick asked. "As long as necessary," Daniels replied. Brooks had finished examining the briefcase and was now standing awkwardly by the desk. "Everything seems to be in order," he said to Daniels. "Just legal papers." "Check his ID again," Daniels instructed, handing over Nick's bar card. Brooks examined it carefully. "This looks legitimate. The hologram and watermarks are present." "Run it through the system," Daniels insisted. While Brooks stepped out to verify the credentials, Nick was left alone with Officer Daniels. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tensions. "You know this is wrong," Nick finally said quietly. Daniels leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Just doing my job, sir. Security is my priority." "We both know what this is about," Nick replied. "And it has nothing to do with security." The clock ticked to 8:52 a.m. In 8 minutes, Nick would officially be late for court. In 8 minutes, his client's faith in him would begin to waver. In 8 minutes, Judge Sandoval would note his absence. And there was nothing he could do about it. In courtroom 302, Judge Patricia Sandoval glanced at the clock on the wall. 8:58 a.m. Her courtroom was filling up for the 9 a.m. session. The prosecutor, Jessica Chen, was already at her table, arranging files in neat stacks. The court reporter was setting up her equipment. The clerk was reviewing the day's docket, but the defense table remained empty. At the back of the courtroom, Darius Wilson sat nervously with his mother. At 22, he looked younger in his new dress shirt and tie, both slightly too big for his slender frame. His mother had insisted on buying them for court, wanting him to make a good impression. Now he tugged at the collar, his eyes fixed on the empty table where his lawyer should be. "Where's Mr. Bowden?" he whispered to his mother. "He's always early." Mrs. Wilson checked her phone for the third time in 5 minutes. "I don't know, baby, but he'll be here," he promised. The bailiff called the court to order at precisely 9 a.m. Judge Sandoval entered, her black robes flowing as she took her seat at the bench. She was a woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair cut in a practical bob, reading glasses perched on her nose, and a reputation for running her courtroom with clock-like precision. "Good morning," she said, scanning the room. Her gaze lingered on the empty defense table. "I see we're missing counsel for the defendant in our first matter." Prosecutor Chen stood. "Your Honor, Mr. Bowden is representing the defendant in the A.T. State v. Wilson. I haven't heard from him this morning, which is unusual. He's typically very punctual." Judge Sandoval frowned. "Mr. Wilson, are you present in the courtroom?" Darius stood shakily. "Yes, Your Honor." "Have you heard from your attorney this morning?" "No, ma'am. I mean, Your Honor. He called earlier and said he was on his way. He should be here." The judge checked her watch. "It's now 9:02. We'll give Mr. Bowden a few more minutes, but I run a tight schedule. Ms. Chen, do you have other matters we could address first?" "Yes, Your Honor. I could handle the Perez continuance while we wait." Judge Sandoval nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed with that matter." As the court moved on to other business, Darius sank back into his seat, a knot forming in his stomach. Mr. Bowden had promised to file a motion that could get his whole case thrown out. Without that motion, Darius was looking at possible jail time for drugs that weren't even his. In the hallway outside courtroom 302, Zoe Washington, Nick's paralegal, arrived with an armful of additional files. She'd planned to slip them to Nick before the hearing began. She approached the courtroom door, but paused when she saw the defense table empty through the small window. Confused, she checked her phone. No messages from Nick, which was strange. He always let her know if plans changed. Zoe ducked back into the hallway and tried calling Nick. The call went straight to voicemail. "Nick, it's Zoe. I'm at the courthouse with those additional cases you wanted. Where are you? Darius is here, but you're not in the courtroom. Call me back ASAP." Inside the courtroom, the Perez matter concluded quickly. Judge Sandoval looked at the clock again. 9:12 a.m. "Ms. Chen, any word from Mr. Bowden?" "No, Your Honor." The judge's frown deepened. "This is highly unusual for Mr. Bowden. Mr. Wilson, when did you last speak with your attorney?" Darius stood again. "Around 8:15, Your Honor. He said he was arriving." "At the courthouse." Judge Sandoval turned to her clerk. "Ms. Rodriguez, please contact security to see if Mr. Bowden has checked into the building." The clerk stepped out to make the call. The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the shuffling of papers and the occasional cough. Ms. Rodriguez returned a few minutes later. She approached the bench and spoke quietly to the judge. "Your Honor, security reports that an attorney was delayed at the attorney's entrance, but they provided no name. They said the matter is being handled." Judge Sandoval's eyebrows rose slightly. "Delayed? For nearly 20 minutes? That seems excessive." She tapped her gavel. "Once? Ms. Chen, Mr. Wilson, we'll take a brief recess. I want to understand what's happening with Mr. Bowden. Court will resume in 15 minutes." As the judge left the bench, Darius turned to his mother, worry clear on his face. "Something's wrong, Mom. Mr. Bowden wouldn't just not show up. He..." believes in my case. Mrs. Wilson squeezed her son's hand. Don't worry. Judge Sandoval seems fair. She'll find out what's happening. But as Judge Sandoval disappeared into her chambers, her expression was troubled. In her 15 years on the bench, Nick Bowden had never been late to her courtroom. Not once. Something was definitely wrong. Zoe Washington paced the hallway. Outside courtroom 302, dialing Nick's number for the fourth time. Again, straight to voicemail. This wasn't like him at all. In the 2 years she'd worked as his paralegal, Nick had never been late for court, let alone missing entirely. She approached a passing bailiff. "Excuse me, have you seen Attorney Nick Bowden this morning?" African-American man, charcoal suit, carrying a brown leather briefcase. The bailiff shook his head. "Sorry, ma'am. I just came on duty." Zoe bit her lip, thinking. If Nick had arrived at the courthouse as planned, something must have delayed him between the entrance and the courtroom. She decided to retrace the steps he would have taken. The attorney's entrance was on the east side of the building. Zoe hurried down the marble corridor, her low heels clicking against the floor. The courthouse was a maze of hallways and rooms, but she knew Nick's routine by heart. He always came in through the attorney's entrance, stopped by the attorney preparation room to review his notes one final time, and then proceeded to the courtroom. When she reached the preparation room, she found it empty except for an older, white attorney reviewing documents. "Excuse me, Mr. Goldstein, have you seen Nick Bowden this morning?" The older attorney looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Bowden? No, I haven't. Isn't he in Sandoval's court today? The Wilson case?" "Yes, but he hasn't shown up? It's not like him to be late." Mr. Goldstein frowned. "That is odd. Bowden's usually the first one here." He paused. "You know, I did hear something about a disturbance at the attorney's entrance earlier. Security issue of some kind." Zoe's concern deepened. "Thanks. I'll check there." As she headed toward the attorney's entrance, she passed another attorney she recognized, Maria Gonzalez, from Judge Wu's courtroom. "Maria, have you seen Nick Bowden today?" Maria stopped, her expression shifting to one of discomfort. "Actually, yes. About 30 minutes ago at the attorney's entrance. He was having some kind of issue with security." "What kind of issue?" Zoe asked, alarm bells ringing in her mind. Maria lowered her voice. "An officer was giving him a hard time about his credentials. Wouldn't let him through the attorney's entrance. It seemed, well, it didn't seem right." "Which officer?" Zoe demanded. "Older white guy, gray hair. I think his name tag said Daniels." Maria glanced at her watch. "I'm sorry, I have to get to court. I hope Nick is okay." Zoe's worry turned to anger. She'd heard Nick talk about similar experiences before. Being questioned, stopped, asked for extra identification despite his professional appearance and credentials, but never at the courthouse where he worked almost daily. She reached the attorney's entrance. A different officer was now posted there, a younger woman who smiled politely as Zoe showed her bar card. "Excuse me, I'm looking for Attorney Nick Bowden. I heard he might have had an issue here earlier with Officer Daniels." The female officer's smile faltered slightly. "I just came on shift, but security matters are handled in the office down that hallway." She pointed to a corridor to the right. Zoe followed the direction, moving quickly now. The corridor was dimly lit compared to the main areas of the courthouse, with doors marked Maintenance and Storage on either side. At the end was a door labeled Security. Just as she reached for the handle, the door opened. Officer Brooks stepped out, nearly colliding with her. "Excuse me," he said automatically. "I'm looking for Attorney Nick Bowden," Zoe said firmly. "Is he in there?" Brooks hesitated, his eyes flickering back toward the room. "I'm his paralegal," Zoe added. We have a case before Judge Sandoval right now. She's called a recess because he's missing. At the mention of Judge Sandoval, Brooks seemed to make a decision. Wait here, he said, disappearing back inside the room. Through the partially open door, Zoe caught a glimpse of Nick sitting in a chair, his face a careful mask of professional composure that she knew hid his true feelings. The clock on the fee wall opposite her read 9:22 a.m. Court would resume in 5 minutes, and Judge Sandoval's patience would not last forever. In her chambers, Judge Patricia Sandoval removed her reading glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. 20 years on the bench had taught her to trust her instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling her something wasn't right about Nick Bowden's absence. Your Honor? Her bailiff, Officer Washington, stood at the door. The clerk checked with security again. They say an attorney is being processed at the attorney's entrance, but won't give a name. Processed? Judge Sandoval repeated, her tone sharp. What does that mean exactly? They wouldn't say, Your Honor. Judge Sandoval stood, her decision made. I'm going to see for myself. Your Honor, court resumes in 5 minutes. Then the EE, court, will have to wait. She straightened her robes. Mr. Bowden has appeared before me for 6 years and has never been late. Not once. Officer Washington knew better than to argue. Judge Sandoval's reputation for fairness was matched only by her determination. When she believed something was wrong, she investigated personally. Together they walked briskly through the courthouse's back corridors, the ones judges used to avoid public areas. As they approached the security section, they encountered Zoe Washington standing outside the security office door. Your Honor! Zoe exclaimed, relief washing over her face. Nick is in there. They've been holding him for almost 40 minutes. Judge Sandoval's expression hardened. Who's they, Ms. Washington? An Officer Daniels, mostly, and another younger. Officer. The judge nodded to her bailiff, who stepped forward and opened the door without knocking. Inside, Nick Bowden sat in a chair, his posture straight despite the circumstances. Officer Daniels stood against the wall, while Officer Brooks was returning Nick's bar card to him. All 3 men looked up in surprise as Judge Sandoval entered, her black robes and stern expression creating an immediate shift in the room's power. Dynamics, Your Honor, Nick said, rising to his feet. What is going on here? Judge Sandoval demanded, her voice carrying the full weight of her authority. Officer Daniels straightened. Security matter, Your Honor. Just doing our job. Your job is delaying proceedings in my courtroom, she replied coolly. Mr. Bowden, are you being detained? It appears so, Your Honor, Nick answered carefully. I arrived at 8:15, but, officer. Daniels questioned my credentials and refused to let me through the attorney's entrance. He then confiscated my bar card and phone and has been holding me here while verifying my identity. Judge Sandoval turned to Officer Daniels. Is this accurate? We had security concerns. What specific concerns? The judge interrupted. We've had issues with unauthorized individuals using fake credentials, Daniels said, his tone defensive. And what made you suspect Mr. Bowden specifically? He appears in my courtroom several times a month. Daniels hesitated. He wasn't someone I recognized. Yet you let others pass without such scrutiny? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Judge Sandoval surveyed the room, noting Nick's open briefcase and its contents spread across the desk. Her eyes narrowed. Have you searched Mr. Bowden's belongings? Standard security procedure, Daniels replied, but his confidence was fading under her gaze. Those documents contain privileged attorney-client information, Judge Sandoval said, sharply. You've potentially compromised a case currently before my court. Officer Brooks looked increasingly uncomfortable. Your Honor, I was just returning Mr. Bowden's identification. We verified it's authentic. After detaining him for nearly 40 minutes, the judge noted. She turned to Nick. Mr. Bowden, do you have everything you need for court? Yes, Your Honor, Nick replied, gathering his papers and returning them to his briefcase. Though, I haven't had time to review my notes or speak with my client. Judge Sandoval checked her watch. We'll delay another 15 minutes to give you time to prepare. She turned to Officer Daniels. Officer, I expect a full report on this incident on my desk by the end of the day, and I strongly suggest you familiarize yourself with the attorneys who regularly appear in this courthouse. Yes, Your Honor, Daniels replied stiffly. As Nick collected his belongings, the judge added, Mr. Bowden, if you've been mistreated or discriminated against, there are formal complaints you can file. Nick met her eyes, reading the unspoken understanding there. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll consider my options. Together they left the security office, Zoe falling into step beside them with obvious relief. As they walked toward courtroom 302, Judge Sandoval spoke quietly. This shouldn't have happened, Mr. Bowden. No, it shouldn't have, he agreed simply. I've seen you in my courtroom for years. You're one of the most prepared attorneys who appears before me. I try to be, Your Honor. The judge paused before they reached the public corridor. When you're ready to file that complaint, let me know. This court doesn't tolerate discrimination of any kind. Nick nodded, his professional demeanor firmly back in place, despite the morning's events. I appreciate that, Your Honor. As they approached the courtroom where Darius waited anxiously, Nick straightened his tie and took a deep breath. The incident had shaken him more than he wanted to admit, but his client needed him focused and effective. Judge Sandoval watched him with respect. In her courtroom, at least, justice would be applied equally today. As Nick entered courtroom 302, he spotted Darius immediately. The young man's face lit up with relief, though concern quickly followed as he noted his attorney's tense expression. Nick forced a reassuring smile and strode confidently to the defense table. Mr. Bowden, are you okay? Darius whispered as Nick set down his briefcase. I'm fine, Nick replied quietly. Just a misunderstanding at security. Nothing for you to worry about. He didn't mention the confrontation or detention. Today needed to be about Darius and his case, not about what had happened to Nick. He'd deal with that later. Zoe slipped into the seat behind them. I organized everything while you were delayed, she whispered, passing him a neatly tabbed folder. The Jenkins precedent is on top. Nick nodded gratefully. His hands were steady as he arranged his materials, but inside he felt unsettled. The morning's events had thrown him off his carefully cultivated rhythm. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. Prosecutor Jessica Chen approached his table before taking her seat. Everything all right, Nick? She asked quietly. It's not like you to be late. Minor security issue, he replied neutrally. Nothing serious. Jessica looked skeptical, but nodded. Well, glad you made it. Wilson's an important case. As she returned to the prosecution table, Nick wondered if she would have been so understanding had she known the details. Jessica was fair as prosecutors went, but she was still part of a system that often viewed Nick and his clients with automatic suspicion. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Sandoval took the bench. Her expression was once again impassive and professional, giving no indication of what had transpired in the security office. We will now resume with case number 24 CR 1073, State versus Wilson, she announced. Mr. Bowden, I understand there were some security delays this morning. Are you prepared to proceed with your motion? Yes, Your Honor. Thank you for your patience, Nick replied, rising to his feet. As he began his argument for suppressing the evidence in Darius's case, Nick felt himself struggling to find his usual rhythm. The words were there. He'd prepared meticulously as always, but his mind kept slipping back to the security office, to Officer Daniels's dismissive treatment, to the helplessness he'd felt despite his credentials, education, and professional standing. The officer's report clearly states the search was conducted at 10:30 p.m., Nick continued, forcing himself back to the present. Yet the warrant specifically permitted execution only between 6:20 a.m. and 9:00 p.m. Jessica objected, arguing that the time discrepancy was a simple clerical error. Nick countered that constitutional rights couldn't be dismissed as clerical errors, but his argument lacked its usual fire. Judge Sandoval watched him closely. Mr. Bowden, you mentioned the Jenkins precedent in your written motion. Could you elaborate on its relevance here? Nick froze momentarily. The Jenkins case, the one Zoe had specifically highlighted. His mind went blank. In all his years of practice, he'd never lost track of a key precedent during oral arguments. Zoe slid the tabbed folder forward slightly. Nick glanced down, saw the highlighted case, and recovered. Yes, Your Honor. In Jenkins, the Fifth Circuit held that nighttime executions of daytime-only warrants constitute a fundamental violation of Fourth Amendment protections. As he continued, Nick regained some of his confidence, but he knew he wasn't performing at his best. The morning's confrontation had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. When he finally sat down, Darius leaned over. You did great, Mr. Bowden. But Nick knew otherwise. He'd been adequate, not excellent. His concentration had been fragmented, his delivery less compelling than usual. And in a system already stacked against young black men like Darius, adequate might not be enough. Judge Sandoval reviewed her notes before speaking. I'll take this matter under advisement and issue my ruling tomorrow morning. Both counsel presented strong arguments. As the court moved on to the next case, Nick gathered his materials with a sense of dissatisfaction. Today should have been a clear win. The warrant violation was textbook. Instead, it was now uncertain. What happens next? Darius asked nervously. We wait for the judge's ruling, Nick said. But I'm optimistic. It wasn't entirely a lie. Judge Sandoval was fair. She would apply the law correctly. But Nick couldn't shake the feeling that his compromised performance might have cost his client. As they left the courtroom, Nick's professional mask remained firmly in place. But inside, anger and determination were building. What had happened this morning wasn't just about him. It was about a system where even a Harvard-educated attorney in a tailored suit could be treated like a criminal based on the color of his skin, and it was time to do something about it. Outside the courtroom, Zoe caught up with Nick as he said goodbye to Darius and his mother. I'm so sorry about what happened this morning, she said as they walked toward the courthouse exit. It was completely unacceptable. Nick nodded, his expression grim. It's not the first time something like this has happened, but it's the first time in this courthouse. You should file a complaint, Zoe urged. Even Judge Sandoval thought so. Nick was about to respond when Zoe suddenly stopped walking. Wait, the cameras. What cameras? The security cameras, Zoe explained, her eyes widening with realization. Nick, the entire courthouse is under video surveillance. They installed the new system last year after that witness intimidation case, remember? There's footage of everything that happened this morning. Nick paused, considering this information. You're right. Every hallway, every entrance, and definitely the security office, Zoe added. I noticed the camera in the corner when I found you there." For the first time since the confrontation, Nick felt a glimmer of hope. Without evidence, it would be his word against Officer Daniels's, a scenario he'd seen play out countless times in favor of law enforcement. But with video footage? "If I file a complaint," Nick said slowly, "they can't deny what happened. It's all recorded." "Exactly," Zoe nodded enthusiastically. "This isn't just about you, Nick. How many others has this happened to who didn't have the knowledge or resources to fight back? People who couldn't risk making waves?" Nick thought of Darius, of all his clients who faced a system designed to work against them. He thought of his father's words. "The law is meant to protect everyone equally, but it doesn't work that way unless good people make it work." "I'll request the footage tomorrow," Nick decided, "and then I'll file a formal complaint with courthouse, administration." What he didn't say, what he didn't need to say to Zoe, who understood, was that he was taking a risk. Making enemies of courthouse security could complicate his practice, affect his clients. But staying silent would make him complicit. The truth was right there, captured on camera. All he had to do was bring it to light. That evening, Nick sat in his office long after his last client had left. The city lights twinkled outside his window as he stared at the blank complaint form on his computer screen. His phone rang, breaking his concentration. The caller ID showed Judge Wallace Edwards, his former mentor and one of the few black judges in the county's history, now retired. "Judge Edwards," Nick answered warmly. "It's good to hear from you." "Nick, my boy, I heard about what happened at the courthouse today. Word travels fast." Nick wasn't surprised. The legal community was small, and news of his detention had likely spread through the courthouse grapevine by lunchtime. "I'd like to hear your version," Judge Edwards said. "Can you meet me for dinner?" An hour later, they sat in a quiet corner of Edwards' favorite steakhouse. The retired judge listened intently as Nick recounted the morning's events, his expression growing increasingly grave. "So, you're going to file a complaint," Edwards said when Nick finished. "It wasn't a question." "I'm planning to," Nick replied. "There's video footage of the whole thing." Edwards nodded slowly, cutting a piece of steak. "And you've thought about the consequences?" "Some," Nick admitted. "But with the video evidence?" "Evidence can be complicated," Edwards interrupted gently. "Let me tell you what you're up against." He set down his fork and leaned forward. "First, there's the backlash. Officers like Daniels have friends throughout law enforcement. The same officers who are witnesses in your cases, who process your clients, who provide security in your courtrooms." "I can't let that stop me," Nick said. "I'm not saying you should. I'm saying be prepared." Edwards took a sip of water. "Second, there's the publicity. The media loves these stories, but they rarely tell them right. Your name, your practice, your clients, all will be affected." Nick thought of Darius and his other clients, many already distrustful of the system. Would this help or hurt their cases? "Third," Edwards continued, "there's the emotional toll. I filed complaints twice during my career. Both times, the system closed ranks. Both times, they tried to make it about me, that I was too sensitive, playing the race card, making something out of nothing." Nick remembered the security office, the feeling of powerlessness despite his credentials and position. "So, you're saying I shouldn't file?" "No." Edwards's voice was firm. "I'm saying understand what you're walking into. When I was your age, I stayed quiet too many times, thinking I was protecting my career, my clients. But every time we stay silent, we become complicit." He paused. "Your father understood that." Nick smiled sadly at the mention of his father. he would have marched straight to the chief judge's office. He would have, Edwards agreed. But he didn't have the platform you have, the education, the reputation, the video evidence. They finished their meal, discussing strategy. As they parted outside the restaurant, Judge Edwards clasped Nick's shoulder. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But remember, this isn't just about one morning or one officer. It's about changing a system. And change is always hard-fought." Back home, Nick couldn't sleep. He replayed the morning's events, imagining different outcomes. What if he'd argued more forcefully? What if he'd simply complied without question? What if he'd been wearing jeans instead of a suit? Would any of it have mattered? By dawn, he'd made his decision. He would file the complaint, request the footage, and follow through regardless of the consequences. If he, with all his privilege and resources, couldn't challenge this injustice, how could he ask his clients to believe in the system? At 8:30 a.m., Nick walked into the county courthouse administration office, complaint form in hand. The secretary looked up, recognition flashing across her face. "Mr. Bowden, what can I help you with today?" "I need to file a formal complaint regarding an incident that occurred yesterday morning," Nick said, sliding the form across the desk. "I was unlawfully detained by Officer Robert Daniels at the attorney's entrance." The secretary's expression remained neutral as she accepted the form. "I'll make sure this gets to the appropriate department. Is there anything else?" "Yes," Nick said. "I'm also formally requesting copies of the security camera footage from the attorney's entrance and the security office between 8:15 and 9:30 a.m. yesterday." Something flickered in the secretary's eyes. "You'll need to fill out a separate form for that request. I'll get one for you." Nick completed the second form, noting the specific camera locations and time frames. As he handed it back, the secretary seemed to hesitate. "Just so you know, Mr. Bowden, records requests can take up to 30 days to process." "I understand," Nick replied, "but given the serious nature of this incident, I hope it will be expedited." 3 days later, Nick received an email from courthouse administration. He opened it in his office, Zoe standing nervously nearby. "What does it say?" she asked. Nick read aloud. "In response to your request for security footage from March 15th, we regret to inform you that due to a technical malfunction in the security camera system, no footage is available from the attorney's entrance or security office during the requested time period. The malfunction has since been corrected. We apologize for any inconvenience." Zoe's mouth fell open. "A technical malfunction? That's convenient." Nick leaned back in his chair, a mix of anger and resignation washing over him. It was exactly as Judge Edwards had warned, the system protecting its own. "What now?" Zoe asked. Before Nick could answer, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed, "Judge Sandoval's chambers." "Nick Bowden speaking," he answered, putting the call on speaker. "Mr. Bowden, this is Judge Sandoval." Her voice was crisp and professional. "I understand you filed a complaint about your detention on Monday morning." "Yes, Your Honor, I have." "And I presume you've been told the security footage is unavailable?" Nick's pulse quickened. "Yes, just now, actually." There was a pause. "Mr. Bowden, about that security incident on Monday morning, there's something important you should know." Judge Sandoval's voice took on a different tone, one that reminded Nick of his father's when he'd say, "The law is meant to protect everyone equally, but it doesn't work that way unless good people make it work." As part of a new judicial oversight pilot program, all security camera feeds are automatically backed up to secure servers in each judge's chambers. I requested the footage from Monday morning immediately after our encounter with Officer Daniels. Nick and Zoe exchanged stunned looks. The cameras captured everything, Mr. Bowden. Every word, every action. And it seems Officer Daniels has a pattern of similar incidents with minority attorneys and courthouse visitors. I've already forwarded the complete footage to the County Oversight Board, the State Bar Association, and the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. She paused again. Justice may be blind, Mr. Bowden, but in my courtroom, the cameras see everything. Nick sat in stunned silence for a moment, then found his voice. Thank you, Your Honor. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Judge Sandoval replied. This isn't a favor. It's how the system should work. After the call ended, Zoe clapped her hands. She had the footage all along. Nick shook his head in amazement. Judge Edwards was right. Change happens when good people make it happen. 3 weeks later, Nick stood at the attorney's entrance of the courthouse. Officer Daniels was gone, reassigned to a different facility pending the outcome of an investigation. In his place stood a new officer who smiled and greeted each attorney by name. "Good morning, Mr. Bowden," she said, checking his bar card quickly and professionally. "Good morning, Officer Rivera," he replied, returning her smile. Inside, Nick spotted Darius waiting by the elevators. The young man waved excitedly. "Mr. Bowden, I got the job," Darius said as Nick approached. "The community college hired me for their IT department." "That's fantastic," Nick said, genuinely pleased. Judge Sandoval had dismissed all charges against Darius 2 weeks earlier, citing the improper search warrant. With his record clean, Darius had been able to apply for the job he'd wanted. "I couldn't have done it without you," Darius said. "My mom wants to have you over for dinner to say thanks." "I'd like that," Nick replied. "But remember, you did the hard work. I just made sure the system worked the way it's supposed to." As they parted ways, Nick headed to Judge Sandoval's courtroom for a new case. The footage from that morning had indeed made waves. The County Oversight Board had launched a comprehensive review of security procedures. The Department of Justice was investigating patterns of discrimination in the courthouse, and 3 other attorneys had come forward with similar experiences. It wasn't a complete victory. Change rarely happened overnight, but it was a start. Nick paused at the courtroom door, thinking of his father. The law is meant to protect everyone equally, but it doesn't work that way unless good people make it work. On the bench, Judge Sandoval met his eyes and nodded slightly in recognition. Nick took his place at the defense table, opened his briefcase, and prepared to do what he did best: ensure that justice, truly blind to everything but the facts and the law, was served. His father would have been proud. That was the end of The Gavel's Eye. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story about justice, bias, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Where are you listening from today? We'd love to know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking content like this. Don't forget to share with friends and family who might appreciate both the entertainment and the important message. Together, we can spread awareness and kindness through storytelling. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most important act of courage is simply shining a light on the truth.